Well, hello. Thank you for tuning in to join us here online. Unfortunately, we had a bit of a hiccup on Sunday with our sermon recording, so I'm recording this after the fact. It's Tuesday, a couple days later, but I wanted to make sure that everyone had a chance to hear this message as we're starting a brand new series as a church. I'm really excited because we're going to dive into our next spiritual discipline and what we've been calling the practices of Jesus. Historically, these are called the spiritual disciplines, but really they're just practices of Jesus. They're things that Jesus himself did in his life that we're looking to imitate in our lives. And not just for the sake of doing things, not just for the sake of having more religious tasks, but really the goal of these practices of Jesus is that we would spend time with Jesus, that we would be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and ultimately do what Jesus did. And so that's the goal of these practices of Jesus. And so if you remember last fall as a church, we started with prayer and we spent a while just studying out prayer, looking to implement different ways of doing prayer, some out of the box types of prayer that maybe we haven't always done in the past. So that was great. And then in the spring, we took a while to focus on what we called the one another way. We looked at all those one another passages in the New Testament and really how Jesus lived a one another lifestyle, and talked for a while about that. And then we looked at hospitality in the month of May. We spent a little bit of time just looking at hospitality, loving our neighbors, all that kind of stuff. And then we took a break, and now we are diving into our next practice of Jesus, our spiritual discipline, which is Sabbath. Sabbath. Sabbath, in short, is simply time set aside for rest and worship. Rest and worship. It's commandment number 4 in the 10 Commandments, right? So it's important. It's part of the 10 Commandments, and it's based really in the creation story. If you go all the way back to Genesis 1 and 2, we see that God in 6 days, whether you believe that's a literal 6 days or 6 eras of time, perhaps, regardless of what you think about that, it says that in 6 days, God made the heavens and the earth, but on the 7th day, he rested from all his work, and he blessed that day and made it holy. And we're going to study out that passage in this series in a couple weeks, but that's really, it's grounded in the creation account and in God himself choosing to rest and enjoy. He says it's very good. He just enjoys his creation, rejoices in it, and rests. And so we're going to look at all that together. I just want to say at the outset of this series, the goal of this series is not to become Jews, okay? Our goal is not to reinstate the Old Testament Sabbath and be all legalistic about it. And that's really not what we're trying to do here. The goal of this study is really just to help us slow down, rest, and connect with God. That's the goal. Slow down, rest, connect with God. And so we're going to explore the ins and outs of what that means. We're going to look at what that means for different people in different stages of life, because Sabbath is going to look different, whether you're a single person or married with 3 kids or an empty nester, right? And so we'll look at all those different things. We'll talk about that together, but the goal overall is to slow down, rest, and connect with God. I'm going to be referencing a couple books throughout this series and a number of quotes today. Those 2 books are The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. That's by John Mark Comer. It's a great read, really easy read. It kind of reads just like a conversation. Pretty easy to read. So, and it talks more than just about Sabbath. He goes into a lot of really what the title says, the elimination of hurry, slowing down in our nonstop culture. Another good book that I'm going to be referencing is called Subversive Sabbath by A.J. Swoboda. And it's a little bit deeper, a little bit more meaty. And so if you're looking for a companion book to kind of go along with this, if you want to go a little bit deeper in this series, highly recommend one of those 2 reads. But the title for today, so we kind of just introduced this topic. The title today is simply Rest for Your Soul. Rest for your soul. I want to begin with a verse out of Ecclesiastes chapter 1. In Ecclesiastes 1 verse 8, the teacher of Ecclesiastes says, "All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. This is written around 3,000 years ago. But around 3,000 years ago, the teacher of Ecclesiastes touches on what we know to be true today, this universal human truth, which is that the eye never has enough, the ear never has enough. We never really can satisfy all of our human desires. We have these desires, and yet they're never fully satisfied. And as he says, that's wearisome. He says it's wearisome more than one can say. A more recent poet simply said, I can't get no satisfaction. Right? That's the Rolling Stones for you young people who don't know that quote. But I can't get no satisfaction. This is just a universal human condition, that we have this infinite desire within us, and yet we just can't ever seem to be fully satisfied. We always want more. We always feel like we're one purchase away, one more vacation away, one relationship away, and we feel like we just want more and more and more, and we never fully are satisfied. There's a monk named Thomas Aquinas back in the 1200s, and Thomas Aquinas was a brilliant guy. He's known as kind of the king of the scholastics, some of the first people to really think logically with the scriptures, and kind of laid the foundations for the Reformation a few centuries later. But Thomas Aquinas, brilliant monk, and monks have the time to sit around and think about this stuff. And he asked the question, what would it take? What would it take to satisfy human desire? And the answer he came up with was basically, you would need everything. You would need to experience every person, every restaurant, every place, go everywhere, do everything, meet every person. And not only would you need to experience everything, you need to be experienced by all those people, to be fully known by every one of those people, understood by every one of those people, right? And so it just goes, well, of course, that's never going to happen. But he's touching on this idea that there's this infinite, this infinite whole, this infinite desire, and the only way to satisfy that is with something of equal infinitude. And of course, this points us to God, right? We're never going to be able to experience and possess everything. This infinite desire within us can only truly be satisfied by the infinite one, by God. And of course, different cultures, different people have come up with solutions to this problem of human desire. You have, in Buddhism, they say to detach, right? To detach from your desires. Your desires are inherently kind of bad, and the goal is to just jettison those, to detach from our desires. And the world tells us just to chase your desires, right? Go after it, chase the next dollar, chase the next relationship, chase the next gadget, the next stamp on your passport, right? Burn out, go for it, just destroy yourself pursuing these things. That's kind of the message of the world. Jesus, I think, would say desire isn't bad, but it needs to be put in its proper place in God. St. Augustine, back in the 400s AD, has this quote that I love. He says, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." Isn't that true? We were made for God, and that's why we have this infinite hole in us, and it creates this restlessness until we rest in God. And so maybe it sounds cliche, we say it all the time, but truly only God can satisfy us. We have this restlessness, this wearisomeness, as the teacher in Ecclesiastes says, and we are restless until we rest in God. Now, on top of that, we have this restlessness due to our human desire, but we also live in a culture that does not make it very easy to rest. It makes our restlessness that much worse. It's interesting. After World War I, wars generally are pretty good for business. Unfortunately, that's just the reality. And after World War I, big business was starting to take a hit and needed to find ways to make more money. And there was this push from businesses in America to get Americans to buy more stuff. And there's this interesting quote from this guy, Paul Mazur. He's a big New York investment banker guy back in that period after World War I. And he said this quote that's really revealing. It says, "We must shift America from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old has been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs." Man, if that hasn't come true, right? I mean, that has proved successful. And here we are today in our culture that is so driven by desires, this consumer culture that really, you look at a quote like this, it's kind of chilling, right? We see that our culture has been engineered to make money off of our restlessness. This restlessness within us. Big business goes, how can I monetize that? And there's our culture that we live in today, right? Again, like I said, one more vacation, one more gadget, one more thing away from rest. That's what marketing is. It promises rest if we had just one more thing. Add to that the fact that our culture also idolizes accomplishment. It's not just about what you have, but it's about what you do, how much you've achieved with your life. I think even in the church, honestly, we can be this way. We can tend to celebrate what you do for God more than just being with God. Add to that the fact that we live in the digital age, right? Where we have our phones, we have infinite distraction at our fingertips. We have social media fueling this epidemic of depression and anxiety, especially in our young people. And, all of this, you put all this together, it just adds to our restlessness, this sense of unsatisfied, restlessness in our souls. The result is spiritual death. I appreciate how John Mark Comer puts it. He says, when our innate human restlessness collides with the digital age and a culture of accomplishment and accumulation, the result is an epidemic of emotional unhealth and spiritual death. Right? That's the truth. Our restlessness, this condition, collides with our culture in which we live. It just makes it all the worse. And we have truly an epidemic of emotional unhealth, mental health crisis that we're living in right now, and spiritual death as well. Swoboda, in his book, he says, our bodies wear ragged, our spirits thirst. We have an inability to simply sit still and be. As we drown ourselves in 24/7 living, we seem to be able to do anything but quench our true thirst for the life of God. We have become perhaps the most emotionally exhausted, psychologically overworked, spiritually malnourished people in history. It's sad, but that's true. That's where we find ourselves. So, in the midst of all of this, what hope is there? Well, in the midst of all of this, Jesus comes and offers us rest. Rest. In Matthew chapter 11, many of us know this verse. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light. I love that. Look at this version. I love this version in the Message. It says, are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. That sounds good. Who wants to live freely and lightly? I go, sign me up, please. What's the opposite of that? It's like living enslaved and heavy. Who wants that? No. I want to live freely and lightly. And I appreciate that translation. He says, I'll show you how to take a real rest. A lot of times we don't really know how to rest well. Um, like even last night, Alyssa and I, we started watching The Mandalorian, where you can mock all you want. We're pretty behind with shows, but we're trying to get on board with things. And we were gonna watch one episode, and we ended up watching 3. It's just how it works, and finished the first season. And it's fun, but shows and things like binging shows, you don't really feel that rested. You feel like I was entertained, but I don't think we always know how to really like recharge our souls well. We tend to confuse entertainment with rest, and what we need is real rest that Jesus offers us. And Jesus offers us real rest, both for our bodies, that's important, our physical bodies, that's important, but also for our souls. Jesus offers us rest on the soul level. He offers us really a whole new way of doing life where we live freely and lightly. If you would turn over to Hebrews chapter 4, I want to read this passage here together in Hebrews chapter 4. The book of Hebrews is really good, but you need to know your Old Testament to really make sense of it. And this passage here can be a bit confusing if you don't know the backstory. The backstory here is that the Hebrew writer is referring to the Israelites in the Old Testament when they were trying to go into the promised land, but they were rebellious against God. And so God doesn't let them in. God actually leads them on a basically wandering through the wilderness for 40 years until a whole generation passes away, and then their kids grow up, and then those kids get to go into the promised land later. But he's going to refer to that, to the kind of rebellion, to the hard-heartedness. He's not going to refer to the event specifically in this passage, but it's good to kind of just know in the back of your mind that's what he's talking about. So in Hebrews 4, let's start in verse 1. It says, "Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed." Okay, again, the they is those Israelites who got hard-hearted and didn't go into the promised land, which would have been restful. The rest he's referring to here is the promised land. "Now we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said, so I declared on oath in anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day in these words, on the seventh day God rested from all his works. And again in the passage above he says, they shall never enter my rest. Therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, okay, again, didn't go into the promised land because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it, quote, today. This he did a long time later when he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, again in the promised land, God would not have spoken later about another day. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. If you get nothing else out of this passage, that's the verse. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. Okay, if you're lost, it's okay, don't worry. But what this is basically saying is that the Israelites, many of them, they couldn't enter the promised land, and they missed out on the rest God had for them. But he's saying that there's these verses that talk about today. In Psalm 95, he's referencing, and basically saying that there's still a promised land. There's still a rest available to you and me. And he says, don't be like the Old Testament Israelites who got hard-hearted. Make every effort that you can enter this rest. God has a Sabbath rest for you. And that's encouraging. And he says that everyone who enters that rest rests from their works, just as God did from his. And so the idea here is that there is a rest available to us, a Sabbath rest available to us today. That Sabbath is not just an Old Testament concept. But this is New Testament literature. This is a New Testament concept that there's a Sabbath rest available to us now. We also see from this passage that Sabbath rest is not just a single day. It's not just like the Jews had this single day set aside, but that it's this kind of almost new state of being, this new lifestyle that we get to live in because of Jesus. Now, there's two sides to that. There's the theological side that because of Jesus, our sins are paid for. Jesus died on the cross. We don't need to be good enough. We don't need to earn our way into heaven. We don't have to be religious enough, perfect enough. We can rest. We need to follow Jesus. But man, we don't have to work our way into heaven. Praise God for that. We can rest from our striving. So that's one side of it. There's another side of it that not only does the cross allow us to rest kind of in that theological sense from our striving and our earning, but there's this kind of day-to-day, just restful spirit. As the Message version said, that we can live freely and lightly, this day-to-day way of living, this restful way of living that we get to enjoy because of Jesus. Consider this table. I'm going to put a table here on the screen. On one side, you have a life of restfulness. On the other side, a life of restlessness. And just consider these concepts. If you're a restless life, you're busy, packed to the brim. You're go, back-to-back things. Whereas in a restful life, there's margin. You might have a lot to do, but there's margin. There's space to be interrupted and not lose your mind, right? There's space to be with God. There's margin in your life. Whereas in a restless life, you're in a hurry all the time. Go. In a restful life, there's slowness. Noise versus quiet. Isolation versus real deep relationships. Restless life of crowds versus restfulness marked by time alone to reflect, to be with God. Distraction versus delight, envy versus enjoyment, confusion about, who am I really before God, and versus clarity, greed versus gratitude, discontent versus content, anxiety versus trust, working for love versus working from love. That's a big difference. And working as accumulation, an accomplishment, rather than working as a contribution to the world and to others, right? Looking at those lists, which one best describes you? Which of those do you resonate with more? Maybe you have some on both sides, but which side do you lean towards? Jesus offers us the life on the left column, a life of restfulness. And Sabbath is one of the primary ways we cultivate that life. It's one of the primary ways we cultivate this restful spirit as a whole. Walter Brueggemann says in his book, Sabbath as Resistance, he says, people who keep Sabbath live all 7 days differently. People who keep Sabbath live all 7 days differently. You become not just the person who takes time off every now and then, but you're the kind of person you cultivate this restful spirit all 7 days as you walk with Jesus in your life. And so this doesn't mean that we don't work hard when the time is to work. We need to work hard when it's time to work, but it means we also take the time to rest, to be with God, to cultivate that spirit of restfulness all week long. And this doesn't just benefit us, this benefits other people too, right? Like when you're rested, people are drawn to that. Think about it. Like, have you ever been in a conversation with someone and they're like super stressed out and they're like exhausted and just burning out, and you can tell, and they're just like worried about every little thing? You ever been in a conversation with that person and thought, man, I just really want what they have? You go, no, I've never thought that. Like, I don't want what they have. I hope my life doesn't get to that point, right? Or I've been at that place many times, but that's like the norm in our world, is just to be worried, stressed out, busy. And so when you're a person of peace, man, you're different. You stand out. When you bring a restful spirit, a spirit of peace, of gratitude, right? Of joy, of ease, when you bring that spirit to your family, your workplace, man, it makes a difference. And so, a practice for us to cultivate this life is Sabbath. I want to read a bit of a longer quote here from Swoboda's book. He says, Sabbath is that ancient idea and practice of intentional rest that has long been discarded by much of the church and our world. Sabbath is not new. Sabbath is just new to us. Historically, Christians have kept some form or another of Sabbath for some 2,000 years, but it has largely been forgotten by the church, which has uncritically mimicked the rhythms of the industrial and success-obsessed West. The result? Our road-weary, exhausted churches have largely failed to integrate Sabbath into their lives as vital elements of Christian discipleship. It is not as though we do not love God. We love God deeply. We just do not know how to sit with God anymore. We have come to know Jesus only as the Lord of the harvest, forgetting that he is Lord of the Sabbath as well. Church, it's time for us to reclaim this ancient practice, to break from our success-obsessed culture in which we live and choose instead to stop and sit in the presence of God. So, let's talk practicals. What does this look like practically? Well, it's going to be different for different people. I mentioned that at the beginning, but it's going to look different for people in different life stages. But generally speaking, in an ideal world, a 24-hour period where you can just set aside time to slow down, rest, and enjoy God, that's ideal. If you can get 24 hours, that's awesome. Alyssa and I are blessed that we can do that. We are able to take our Mondays as our Sabbath, and I know that some others in our church have been taking different days during the week, and that's awesome. If you can take 24 hours, that's great. Sometimes it's not, and if it can be the same day every week, that's really great. Obviously, not everyone can do that. I know even in our church we have, nurses, firefighters, doctors who are on rotating schedules, and it might be that you have to change it week to week which day you pick. For some of us, maybe the idea of a whole day is just seems impossible right now. Maybe you've got young kids or just a job schedule that wouldn't allow that. If that's the case, I would encourage you to think not why can't I do Sabbath, but I would start to think, well, how could I do Sabbath? Perhaps it's not a whole day. Perhaps you do a half day to start, or a few hours in the morning, one of the days. Maybe if you're married with kids, you trade off with your spouse and one person takes the morning, the other person takes the evening, something like that. But, it's going to look different for different people. Now, what do you do during your Sabbath time? Half the problem is that we're asking that question at all, because the point is to not do. But if you're like me and you think practically, you're like, what do I do, during this time? Well, the key words are rest and worship. Okay, rest and worship. If you're wondering about a certain activity, am I allowed to do this? We're not going to get all legalistic about it. Are you allowed to or not? What is rest for one person might not be for another. For me, I love going for a bike ride. For someone else, that might sound exhausting. No way. So it's going to look different in terms even of the activities that you do. But I would generally ask the question, is this rest and worship? So worship doesn't just mean singing Chris Tomlin songs all day, okay? I love some worship music, but that's not the only way to worship. I hope we have a deeper idea of what worship is than that. Worship is just delighting in God and delighting in God's world and the things that he's created. So for me, again, on my Sabbath, I like to turn my phone off. Number one, I think that should be a proverb. Proverbs 32, turn off your phone every Sabbath. It's just, we need to disconnect, guys, from our devices, from this digital world. Get away from the devices, unhook from the news and the media and all that stuff for a period of time, whether it's 24 hours or whether it's just an hour, when you're Sabbathing. Take time to unplug. That's what I do. And then I like to spend a good long time with God. I like to read the Bible, good spiritual book. But then on my Sabbath, I always want to be outside somehow. I just love being in nature. I feel like my soul just gets refreshed and connects with God and nature. So I go outdoors. Maybe it's a hike with the family or playing disc golf by the river. But being outside for me is rest and worship. And so For you, maybe delighting in God and in his creation means you go for a drive in the mountains, or you sit out under the stars, or maybe you get guacamole and queso in your Chipotle order, right? And you just rejoice in the goodness of God, right? Whatever that looks like for you. If you're a relational person, you go, I can't just be alone all day. Maybe you get a coffee or get a beer with a close friend. Maybe you just take a nap, right? In the Jews, in Yiddish, they have something called the Sabbath schluff. So maybe you take the Sabbath schluff and you schluff off for a little bit, take a nap. But like disconnecting from the phone and just practicing rest and worship. Eugene Peterson, in his book, The Pastor, he also points out an important detail, which I think is helpful practically. He says, a day off is not the same as a Sabbath, okay? A day off is not the same as a Sabbath. Why? Think about what you do on your day off, typically. What do you do? Well, for me, I mow the lawn, we do laundry, catch up on house chores, on errands to run, right? You do all the work that you're not paid for. You're not paid by an employer to do, but it is work. And I don't know about you. Some people, my wife feels refreshed folding laundry. That to me is not at all enjoyable. So mowing the lawn, all that stuff. I used to do all that on my Mondays. Now I don't. I find different time to do that because for me, that's not rest and worship. Excuse me. That's just other work that I don't get paid for, but it's work that I need to do. So, I let my lawn grow and get long on Mondays now, and I find different time to do that. So don't just assume that, oh, well, since I've already got a day off in my week, that I'm already doing Sabbath. Sabbath is more intentional than that. Sabbath is taking time specifically to rest and really worship and be with God. And kind of just pampering your soul, filling your soul with joy, getting reconnected to God and disconnected from the world a little bit. It's more intentional than just a day off. So nothing wrong with that. If you need to get your lawn mowed, whatever, do your thing. But just understand that those are different concepts. A day off versus Sabbath. Okay. So at this point, let me just pause. Some of us may be thinking, you know what? This sounds good and nice for some people, but I don't think I need that. I think maybe I'm the exception to the rule. And I guess I would just challenge you to consider, how is your soul doing? Are you refreshed? Are you full of gratitude? Are you overflowing with joy? Or are you exhausted? Are you burning out? I think this is something we all need. The question is not, do we need to practice Sabbath theologically? Is it necessary to be saved? I don't think we need it to be saved. I think some movements believe that, but I think we ignore it at our own peril. It's like the law of gravity. God has built a rhythm into our lives that we need. We're designed to need rest, and we ignore it at our own peril. And so I would encourage us to practice this. And if you're thinking, I don't know if I can, I'm so busy, I've got little kids, whatever it might be. Here's one more quote from Swoboda. This is my last big quote. I really appreciate his heart here. He says, as it relates to the poor, the stay-at-home dad, the person in prison, the disabled, or any person who is in a place of life where Sabbath is excruciatingly problematic, what matters most is not that they do a Sabbath perfectly, but that they try their best in whatever context they find themselves in. While the ideal is to rest one day a week, some simply cannot. And for the person who risks to take a 4-hour window of rest, the Lord will be present with him or her in the midst of the attempt. For the stay-at-home mom who can give 1 hour of quiet and solitude to God after putting her children down to sleep, God will meet her in her intentional rest. God never intended what he gave us as a gift to become a tool of shame or guilt. The Sabbath is for us. We are not for the Sabbath. And of course, that comes from Jesus' famous line, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. But I so appreciate this point here, that it's not about doing this perfectly. It's not about being all legalistic about it. It's just intentionally carving out time to be with God, and God meets us there in whatever form that takes. It's like a dad. If a kid comes to their dad and says, Dad, I want to spend time with you. It just melts a dad's heart. You go, you want to spend time with me? Awesome. I think God feels that way when we carve out time to slow down, to disconnect, and just to be with him and to rest and enjoy him and his world. So just want to encourage us with that. Don't think about all the reasons I can't Sabbath. Think about how could I Sabbath. And I will say it's a discipline, right? It takes discipline to turn off your phone for a day, or it takes discipline to guard that time that you very well could use for other things, right? We all know, okay, if I'm not going to mow my lawn, I'm not going to run these errands, I'm not going to get caught up. And, it takes discipline to do this. But when you say no to something that you want, you're saying yes to something you want even more, right? When you say no to one thing, you're saying yes to something else. And when you say no to these things you want, you're saying yes to something you want even more, which in this case is Jesus. We're saying no to just the nonstop culture, no to, my need to get everything done and be in control. We're saying yes to Jesus, yes to rest, yes to surrender to God, that I don't need to be on the clock 100% of the time. God's in control. God's running this universe, not me. And so this is a discipline, but we're saying yes to Jesus, to being in his presence, to enjoying him, to rest. So a couple final words of encouragement. You might experience the J curve. The J curve is where you get worse. Something kind of gets worse before it gets better. It's funny. I was chatting with Wes. Wes is trying to practice silence more. We're kind of learning about the value of practicing silence and solitude. And he's like, I got up early. I tried just being quiet, listening to God. And then I kind of dozed off and fell asleep. And then I woke up and I looked at the clock. I was like, oh no, I got to go to work. And I haven't even read my Bible, right? He's like, this is stupid. He's like, didn't even read my Bible. Tried practicing this new thing, but it just felt like I it was worse than if I had just not even tried. I should have just read my Bible. And that's a normal experience. Sometimes these things are hard to get into our lives. And it's going to take patience, perseverance, but it does get better. That J curve swoops up if we persevere. So just want to encourage us with that, with Sabbath. I mean, you might feel that. You might feel like you slow down to be with God, and all of a sudden, man, maybe all these worries come flooding in. Maybe all these, emotions that you've been, pushing away in your busyness start flooding in. And it could be difficult at first to practice Sabbath, just to be still and to rest. But I think we'll be grateful that we did it. Swoboda says in his book, he's like, I've never met someone who used to Sabbath. He's like, you start, you're probably going to find that it's profoundly life-giving. So lastly, I'll say this. This is one of the ways we fight Satan. This is spiritual warfare, guys. Like, it's really hard. Honestly, it's hard to tempt somebody who's like rested and emotionally healthy. It's really easy to tempt someone who's exhausted and stressed out. Really easy. And so this is one of the ways that we fight Satan, by just ignoring, saying no to that temptation to be in control, to be go, go, go all the time, and just to rest. Dallas Willard says we must arrange our lives so that sin no longer looks good to us. This is one of the ways we do that. Imagine the impact. Imagine the impact in your workplace, in your family. If we were people who the norm of our lives was that we were well rested and refreshed in God. The norm of our lives might be currently that we're almost never getting all the rest we need, that we're almost never feeling like it's really life to the full. Imagine if the norm, the status quo, was that you got enough rest, that you were refreshed and full of joy, gratitude. Imagine the gift we would be to each other and to those around us. May you answer Jesus' invitation to come to him and find rest for your soul. Love you guys.